Hi, Eric and Jeremy.
Hi, Josh. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you. Can't see you, but I can hear you.
That's okay. We're live on YouTube now, actually. So I'm going to be quiet.
But we'll start. I guess we won't see any of the. But we'll start. I guess we won't see any of the. But we'll start. I guess we won't see any of the. But we'll start. I guess we won't see any of the. But we'll start. I guess we won't see any of the. But we'll start. I guess we won't see any of the. But we'll start. I guess we won't see any of the. But we'll start. I guess we won't see any of the. But we'll start. I guess we won't see any of the. Jeremy, but we'll start. If you're there, I'm hearing a Jeremy of my speaking. If you're there,
yeah, I'm here.
I'm hearing a Jeremy. I'm hearing a loop of me saying something.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I hear a loop as well.
I'm hearing a loop of me
your audio.
saying something.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I hear a loop as well.
I'm hearing a loop of
your
me
audio.
saying something.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I hear a loop as well.
I'm hearing a loop of
your
me
audio.
saying
Yeah,
something.
I'm here. Yeah, I hear a loop as well.
I'm hearing a loop of
your
me
audio.
saying something.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I hear a loop as well.
I'm hearing a loop of
your
me
audio.
saying
Yeah,
something.
I'm here. Yeah, I hear a loop as well.
Oh, phew. Okay. I'm not sure what's going on there. Did you hear that?
What the hell was that?
It was like a speaking,
Yeah, that was a very strange
speaking collage. Yeah, we could make a performance art right here.
Yeah, but I think it sounds good now.
Yeah.
Eric, you're muted. I'm unmuted, and Josh is unmuted.
Yes.
And no one's spotlighted.
Okay. So we won't be able to see. Can you see the participants?
Should I end the YouTube stream and restart it?
I don't know.
Eric?
All the audio just keeps looping. I don't know why that is.
You still hear it looping?
I don't hear it looping.
Me neither.
But I'm only on. We're on Zoom.
Okay, it's stopped now.
Okay.
Okay, it's stopped now.
I'm gonna mute myself.
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 Wow.
It's looping again.
It sure is. Okay. So I'm the only one that's unmuted. So I'm speaking now. I wonder if it'll start looping again. So I'm the only one that's unmuted. So I'm speaking now. I wonder if it'll start looping again. So I'm the only one that's unmuted. So I'm speaking now. I wonder if it'll start looping.
I muted you, Josh, because it was looping.
It sounds like it's an issue with Josh's audio. Josh.
Really?
Josh, are you watching and streaming at the same time? Do you have Facebook on or something? Or
No, I don't actually. I only have Zoom on. That's it. I don't even know what. I'm on Zoom.
Jeremy, I think we were having this problem before when you were unmuted, so I think you have to mute yourself.
He's muted on this Melnick Studios. Well, there's two Melnick Studios. One has a. I'm going to. Okay. Okay, can you hear me right now, you guys? You're all muted as far as I can see. So if you tell me if you can hear me and if we're still having that looping problem.
There's no looping problem when you just spoke.
Aha, okay. So did you locate what it was?
No.
Are you guys on Facebook and YouTube together?
I am. I don't see it on Facebook though.
Uh-huh. Eric, are you on Facebook and YouTube? You're muted, by the way.
Guys, just stop talking, okay? It's all looping. Just everybody mute yourselves and stop. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us online for this presentation today. I'm Eric Stein. I'm the Artistic Director of the Ashkenaz Festival. And, oh boy, we've got that audio echoing now. I'm going to carry on here and tell you about the opera Sheve that we are presenting at the Ashkenaz Festival. Sorry, I think we've got to close this up. Sheve is being presented at the Ashkenaz Festival from August 31st to September 2nd. 3 shows. This is the North American premiere of an incredible work of art that has an incredible story. And we're going to hear all about that story in a moment. I just want to say that the presentation today is sponsored by the Shochet Yiddish Teachers Training Fund and the Steinhardt Foundation, both at the Jewish Foundation of Greater Toronto. And Sheve is presented as part of the 2022 Ashkenaz Festival in partnership with the UCLA Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience and Yiddish Summer Weimar, and with the generous financial support of Canada Council for the Arts, Azrieli Foundation, Toronto Workmen's Circle Foundation, Glenn Gould School at RCM, and the media sponsor is Classical 96.3 FM. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to Josh Horowitz, who is a fantastic musician and composer and a hell of a nice guy. And he's responsible for having done the restoration of this score, including the full orchestration and filling in missing parts of the music. And he will tell you more all about it. And I will now turn it over to Josh. Enjoy.
Okay, thanks, Eric. I think you have to make me host or co-host.
Yep, I'm going to spotlight you.
And then I'll start right in. Okay. And am I host now? You have to unmute, Eric. I'm not sure if I can start already. Unmute yourself and tell me if I'm host already. I didn't see it come up.
You're good to go, Josh.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen right away. Just a second. Be patient here. Okay, good. Can you all see that? Eric, can you see that? Just give me a thumbs up if we're okay. Can't see you or hear you, so.
It's there. I can see it.
Okay, great. So I want to thank all of you who are here. Can't see you or hear you. I'm assuming you're here. And I want to just begin. We're going to go through the score today. There's going to be lots of music examples and some video examples as well. Want to start by saying that you can get a lot of more information at this link right here, basheva.com, that I set up for this whole work. And I would like to thank especially Eric for his Herculean effort in bringing this to light in Toronto. He's been just great and against all odds. And all of the sponsors that he just mentioned, I put up here on the screen, but we'll move very quickly through some of these things. I also want to thank Dr. Diana Matut, who is really the originator of this project. She is the one who located the score at the Yale University auction and sent it to me in 2019 saying, would you like to work on this and actually perform it? And we actually were able to do that in Europe through the support of a lot of people, some of which are on this screen. So with the Yiddish Summer Weimar, we were able to do a performance in Weimar as well as in Łódź, Poland. with an orchestra called the Triangle Orchestra, gleaned from Germany, France, and Poland. Wonderful performers, some of whom might even be here today on this call. And so the work itself, I'm going to go through how it's structured and how we went about reconstructing the parts that were missing and all that. The instrumentation that I actually used for both the European premiere, as well as the one for this North American premiere, is basically a full orchestra, but not with harp and not with brass. Those were too difficult to come by in the original production, so we left them out. And it kind of, as far as the missing harp went, it was kind of a godsend in a way, because it enabled me as an orchestrator to imitate the parts that were supposed to be perhaps written for harp. And that's a lot of fun to do as an orchestrator. So the characters in this opera, there are really four principals. There's the orchestra, there are the four principal characters, and then there is a choir, which kind of acts as a Greek choir and commenting on what's taking place on the stage. So I'm going to use the Yiddish pronunciations that are actually in the libretto for the characters. So we have Bathsheba, who's pronounced Bathsheva, and Nathan, who's pronounced Nosen, and Shaliach, which is the word for a messenger in Hebrew and Yiddish, and David, which is David. So I'm going to say, David, Shaliach, Nosen, and Bathsheba. The opera was originally written by Henich Cohn, and you may know Cohn from his film score of The Dybbuk, if you've ever seen the 1937 Polish film, The Dybbuk. He's the one that did the music for that. He was born in 1890 and he died in New York in 1972. He was born in Kutno, which is near Łódź, Poland, not far from Warsaw. And he was surrounded by music as a young boy. He actually studied formally at the Berlin Academy of Music and was well known in the Polish scene, mainly in the small theater productions, the cabaret productions that were done. He composed more than 40 theater productions that were there, produced in Łódź, in Warsaw, in surrounding cities. And he became very good friends with Isaac Leib Peretz, and also later with Moshe Broderson, one of the premier Yiddish poets. And Broderson is the one who wrote the libretto for this work. Cohn kind of has a rather tragic history, being very well known and kind of hailed as the torchbearer of the new Yiddish music in the interwar period. When he emigrated in 1939 to America, he had a lot of trouble finding footing in the American music scene, and actually died a pauper in New York, 1970, in really a squalid apartment in New York, barely heard of anymore. In fact, in the later years of his life, the way that he got any money at all was by writing, setting the poetry of local women who wanted their music set to music. And so he would sell them these little ditties, and sometimes even ask to have them returned to him so that he could resell them. That's how desperate he was. But like I said, he was before he emigrates to America, he's well known also for some of the film music that he wrote. Like I said, the one for Ansky's The Dybbuk is the most famous of those. And he also was active in this interwar period for his small theater works, even a puppet theater called Chadgadio, which was quite active, actually. And we don't have the scores for those puppet shows. I wish we did, because they would be, I think, as fascinating as some of the other works that he did. I was able to, Diana Matut sent me a whole collection of the songs that he's written, classically oriented, art songs, but in Yiddish. And from the study of some of those songs, I was able to kind of ascertain what Cohn's real aesthetic was. He was very active in the area of Łódź, Poland, and Łódź was a thriving small city in Poland. You can see that there's big buildings there. It's not a tiny shtetl. And he writes this opera in 1924. Now, during 1924, there are other operas that are underway in Europe. And although most of the operas that you would think of, the well-known operas that you know, are either going to be in Italian or even German. And so the idea of writing an opera in more obscure languages, such as the Czech language, these things, and Hungarian, and then finally Yiddish, this is something that begins to happen in the 20th century. And we see it even during the year that he produces Sheve, in 1924. We have Hugh the Drover from Ralph Vaughan Williams, sung in English. It's a ballad opera, kind of also based on folk songs. We have Richard Strauss's Intermezzo, which is a light operetta, but we also have the Cunning Little Vixen of Janacek, sung in the Czech language. So there is this kind of trend, or this acceptance of other languages for the language of opera, other than the hegemony of Italian and German. And even in 1921, we have a kind of an oratorio that's written by Arthur Honegger on the story of David, Le Roi David. And so whether or not Cohn knew this work, we don't know. There is a narrative in this work. The speaking voice does happen. You can hear in this, I think I shared with sound. Tell me if you can not hear. Okay, I hope you can hear that. In Le Roi David. So Cohn doesn't use a speaking voice in his opera, but I do, and I'll explain why that happens later. In Le Roi David, mostly the voice is happening on its own without musical backing behind it. The way that I use the voice, the speaking voice, in the missing parts of Cohn's opera, I backed it with music. So as far as the musical language of Cohn goes, it's very conventional. He was familiar clearly with the work of Saint-Saëns and Rimsky-Korsakov, some of the composers who were involved in a movement which we could call primitivism, where they're kind of reaching back into the idea of primitive life and primitive modes of music. But at the same time, we're hearing the work of Schoenberg, for instance, experimenting with atonality and all kinds of sounds. This is a really rich period of experimentation in the 20s and 30s. And so, for instance, when we compare Cohn's work with Schoenberg or Edgar Varèse, who was Frank Zappa's favorite composer, we hear a distinct difference. He's not in the area of the real hardcore avant-garde. So when we listen to, for instance, Schoenberg's Pierre Lenoir, you can hear him experimenting, for instance, with the idea of a Sprechstimme, which is somewhere halfway between speaking and singing. This is something that Cohn doesn't do, but we hear it in Schoenberg, for instance, in this example. And in the orchestration, for instance, of Varèse, where we can hear real dissonances happening, the kinds of dissonances that we're not going to hear in Cohn's work. I lean a little bit on this type of dissonance in some of the reconstruction, which I'll get to in a minute. But this is the kind of thing that's happening right around the time that Cohn is writing this opera. This is Varèse. Okay, I'm going to move very quickly through some of these. So I hope just to give you a taste of the kind of sonic world that we're dealing with. So like I said, Cohn was very familiar with the classical music that was happening around him. He was an educated composer. And he, especially, for instance, I discovered while working on the score that he even paraphrases a section of Saint-Saëns' Samson and Delilah, which was composed in 1876. I mean, like, more than 40 years before before Cohn writes this opera. And I'm going to play the section that you kind of hear from Samson and Delilah, from the Bacchanale, from that work. And then I'm going to compare it with my own orchestration of Cohn, but you can kind of hear the similarity where he's almost paraphrasing. Here's Samson and Delilah. Just a second. Sorry, hold on. I'll begin it from the beginning. Here we go. Okay. Now I'm going to play the section in Cohn's opera that kind of leans on that, and I'll show you where he even kind of steals almost. So that very last part, we can hear as almost pilfered from Samson and Delilah. I mean, it's very short, so you have to really concentrate just to hear the similarity between that cadence, those two cadences. And here's Cohn. So we know he's kind of leaning on this kind of exoticism that we're hearing in Samson and Delilah, also a biblical story, and kind of giving a nod to that work. So Cohn himself was really hailed during his time as being the person that could really carry Yiddish music, Yiddish infused music, into the modern world, and really kind of was almost like seen as potentially being the prophet of that. And you can read that in a translation of Melech Ravich's Henich Cohn in Mein Lexicon that was published in 1947 with Diana Matut's translation, where they say composers and musicians were needed everywhere for this world. Henich Cohn assumed this out of love. In this field, he had almost no rivals and was indeed quite unrivaled. And because Henich Cohn has Yiddish roots, he also had a Yiddish style, and he was drawn to the music poet Moshe Broderzon. So they really saw him as being the person that could bring Yiddish into this world. And what you're seeing here in front of you is the actual original score that I was working with, that Diana Matut unearthed. Or got from the Yale University auction. And this, in European parlance, this type of score is called a particelle, which basically means it's the piano and voice score. And also you can see on the right side that it's written also for 4-part choir. So you can see the soprano, the alto, the tenor, the bass, and the piano part right here. And there are there's not very much choral music that's written in the work. It's very simple, probably because, it's harder to rehearse a choir and get them in tune and get them to play. So he was very aware, I think, of the resources that he had for the intended first performance. But the particelle is something where you have a piano part, a vocal part, sometimes another stave that's relegated to another instrument, but it's a reduction of what you're thinking about as the orchestral way that you want it to be orchestrated. And it was clear that Cohn wanted this to be orchestrated because there are a couple of notes, a handful of notes that we find in the score where he specifies what kind of sound that he wants. So in this score, you can see on the left side, there's this part that says CLAR, clarinet, and FAG, fagot, which is bassoon in European languages, fagotti, fagot. And so he wanted the clarinet and the bassoon to take over this line. Then later we see FL and OB, that means flute and oboe. And so he wanted the flute and oboe to be playing this line. It doesn't mean that only flute and oboe would be playing that. An orchestrator will see that and fill it out with other parts and other pieces of music, which I'll show you how that's done. But you do see a couple of these here. You see FAG in the top here. He wants this line to be played by the bassoon. So I respected, I think, all of the indications that he had in this score. I don't think there were more than 15 or so, and they were very scant. But he did indicate, for instance, that he wanted a gong at one point, and we didn't have a percussion ensemble in the original performances in the European performances, but we do have these instruments in the version we're going to hear in Toronto, thankfully. So let's look at the story, the background story. You probably know the biblical story, but I'm going to go through it, the bullet points of it very quickly, just so that we can see where we're at in the opera. Basically, the story is that David is, while walking on the roof of his palace, he sees the beautiful woman, Bathsheba, and she's bathing or she's swimming. So he loves what he's looking at. He summons a messenger to bring Bathsheba to him, and then he sleeps or rapes her and impregnates her. And in order to conceal his sin, he then summons Uriah, the soldier in his army who is married to Bathsheba, but who's not Jewish. And he's hoping that by bringing Uriah back to the palace, that Uriah will then sleep with Bathsheba and therefore believe that he has impregnated her. But Uriah is unwilling to violate the ancient code applying to warriors in active service, which is you don't leave your men. And so he sleeps at the foot of the palace rather than going to his wife. And so this plan fails. And after repeated efforts to convince Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba, the king orders rather his general, Joab, to put Uriah on the front lines in order that he will be killed. And that scheme works. In fact, Uriah is killed, and David then is able to marry Bathsheba. But because his actions are displeasing to the Lord sends Nathan, the prophet Nathan, to reprove him, to scold him for this. And Noson does so, and David then repents, apparently, of his sins. But his punishment is then that the first child that he has with Bathsheba will be struck with a severe illness and die unnamed a few days after birth. And David accepts this as his punishment, and that's the basic storyline. I'm going to get back to that in a minute, because even though we follow that storyline, that's not what you're going to actually see and hear in the opera, are these events. And we'll get to that in just a second. Before we do, I'll tell you how the approach that I used in orchestrating it and in filling in the missing scenes. There were 16 pages missing in the 78 pages, which basically was about 10% of the opera. And this happens at a very specific point in the opera where these scenes are missing. And those I had to compose myself with the help of Michael Wex, who supplied us with a new libretto, new text for that portion of it. And when we were discussing with Diana Matut, what the commission was to involve, she was very free about allowing that we didn't have to copy the style of Cohn, either musically or textually, for Wex to copy the linguistic style of Broderson, although I think he does lean on Broderson's style. But as far as the score restoration goes, we were comparing this to the two ways that this is done for museum works. For instance, there are two tacks that you can two styles that you can take. You can either make a recognizable imitation, which means that your work is recognized as your own and not that of the person that you're copying or restoring. So for instance, on the left side here, you see the original Mona Lisa, but an artist that's rendering that same Mona Lisa has changed the background and the color scheme of it so that these rocks in the background are not there. You get this kind of figure here, all this background, the swirling riverway we don't see there. We see a mountainous region instead. And so this is a recognizable copy. In contrast to what we would see as what's called mimetic or imitation, where here's the original work and nothing is supposed to be really changed. It's just supposed to be restored with its original coloring. And so there aren't any extraneous elements or new elements that are brought into this. So we chose to do the recognizable version, which if you look at other score reconstructions, for instance, Luciano Berio's reconstruction of Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, he does the same thing. It gets very modern and cloudy in the part that he's restoring. And I'm not going to show you that here because we just won't have enough time. I did in the original lecture on this. I have it in the addendum in case anybody wants to hear that. But anyway, so the way that we approached this was not to imitate, but to create a new work in between, but one that hopefully segued easily. And so you might not even notice it if you're not paying attention, but the styles are different, and we'll get to that in a minute. So the libretto that Wex was faced with reconstructing happens right around actually what we would consider to be the climax of the opera. If you know that most works are going to peak, their climax is going to happen somewhere at the end of the second act, past the halfway point, but not so far that it's toward the very end. There are different kinds of arcs that you can have in any work, but it happens that the part that was missing was a very advantageous part for me because it represented the part that I could have viewed, we both viewed as being the climax of the opera. And that's a lot more fun to work with than just patching in fragments that you find throughout the score. So in this actual work, what you here is not the actual action. And I was kind of disappointed that we didn't get to see all of the awful things that were happening, because that makes good drama. But rather than that, it seems to be more of a psychological drama. In other words, we enter at the point where all of these deeds are actually pretty much completed. So it begins with the choir singing that David can't sleep, assuming he's already committed his sins. Nathan and the messenger contemplate his guilt. He can't sleep because he's guilty, and they are talking about him, the guilt preventing his sleep. And Shaliach informs Nosen, the prophet at that point, that Uriah has just been killed. Uriah. And so David despairs that he's let his people down. He tells Nosen how he slept with Bathsheba and paved the way to Uriah's death. This is the point where he's confessing to him. And Bathsheba enters at the first time, yelling the word David, David, and asks if your Uriah's death will wipe away their sin. Sin being either the sleeping with each other, or in terms of that time, the raping was something, I guess, that would be seen as a sin on both sides. Something we could certainly argue about today. Sorry about my dog. Probably the mailman's here. So she rocks David to sleep at that point with a song called Stiller, Stiller. Both David and Bathsheba then lament that they're not able to cry. Bathsheba because she's just given birth, and David because he's in shock at his sins, at his own deeds. And the choir sings at that point, "Hail to the king will endure." And this is the point where Nosson then tells David that he's scolding him for his sins. And that's where the opera leaves off. This is where the missing portion happens. So when Wex was reconstructing this point, he takes it up where Nosson then condemns David's actions and informs him that God's going to kill his firstborn. And at this point, I insert a choir moment where the choir sings a victory motet based on the previous victory motets. And this is, of course, meant ironically. When you say, "Long live the king, may he live forever," well, why are they singing that when he's just been informed that his child is going to die? That seems almost a punishment in and of itself. And it was intended to be ironic by my own setting of that. So at this point, there's a conflict that's playing out in David's mind. This is very, very much like Hamlet's, where Wex chooses to have this kind of ghost of Uriah appear, where David is apologizing to him. And Bathsheba at this point is singing a lullaby to her child who has not yet died. And David is pleading with God to spare the newborn's life. But the choir, at this point, I inserted Yedid Nefesh, a prayer, as if God's going to reprieve David, but doesn't actually do that. And then Nosson absolves David of his sin, but the messenger brings the news that the child has just died, has just been killed by God, not his finest moment. So, and then the opera picks up at that point with cone score, where the child is proclaimed dead, and Bathsheba sings a lament, a kind of a very light lament, actually, called "The Birds of Grief." And then the choir sings its victory epilogue, and that's the end of the opera. So let's get to the music. Enough talking. So you might kind of want to know, what is making this Yiddish? What's making it sound Jewish? And thankfully, Cone does not center on the typical kind of interval that you're going to hear in so many works like Scheherazade and Capriccio Español from Ravel, and all these works that are leaning on this kind of Oriental, Middle Eastern kind of thing. And those kind of intervals, he does use those sometimes, but he seems to be more interested in using one particular interval, and that's the interval of the perfect fourth, a fourth. And I'll show you what he's kind of leaning on here. And this is a Barhu, a blessing sung by Sam Weiss from Paramus, New Jersey. And you'll hear this interval, and I'll go through and show you where it's being used in the themes.
Baruch Adonai Mevorach Leolam Va'ed.
Okay, so this that interval. So this fourth is used 2 times in this particular. And that particular interval seems to be what gives this a kind of a liturgical underlayment. So in the shepherd's theme that we get towards the beginning of the opera, we hear this. The very beginning is already that interval. Then we get in Nosson's theme, again, the beginning. Then we get David's theme of sin, where he begins also with the fourth. So there he's using that Oriental interval. Then we get the palace theme. This is what the choir sings. And there it is again. Then we get it in the consolation theme that Sheve sings. So we hear that theme again, and we get it later. And we get it in the war theme. We get it in the admonishment theme that Nosen is singing to David. And then we get it in the grief theme that Sheve sings when she learns that her child has died. Sorry. So we get it. And again. So this interval just kind of is a thread through the entire opera. And we hear that also, it's not just liturgical music that we can hear that. We do hear it in Jewish secular music. Here we're going to hear like this theme opens the beginning of a well-known Jacques klezmer piece, common in Romania. That very opening theme is a fourth, and we hear it here. Yeah. So we hear this all over the place, and here you'll hear it in the Birds of Grief theme. This is what it sounds like in the actual opera. Okay, so as we move on, we're going to look at some of the techniques that that Cohn is using in the opera. That's the first thing, is this interval of the fourth. And it's also expressed in this particular technique, which is sometimes called Foberdun, which is a very simple way of harmonizing where we have parallel harmonies, where you have the fourth on top and a third below. Very easy way to harmonize something, and something that has developed already in the 14th century, was very popular among the motet composers. Here you can hear an example of this parallel harmonies, this Foberdun technique used in the early motets. And you can even hear it in Beethoven's Sonata Number 3 in C major, in the Allegro movement. Very fast. Those are same chords. And Cohn uses that same technique, that time-tested technique, and you'll hear it here. Hear those parallel harmonies moving down. So as an orchestrator, that poses a specific challenge in making it sound interesting, because it happens quite frequently in this. And so in orchestrating something like that, I would split it up into the full orchestra so that the rhythm will sound a little bit different. I'll play it once more in the piano version. And here's the way it sounds in the orchestra. So you can see the part where it's orchestrated. There's a lot more happening than just those chords. There are violins that are moving up and down the chords, a piano that's taking parts of it and skipping it about, and the winds on top doing also different parts. I didn't add any harmonies there, just added textures based on what I would call heterophonic orchestration, where we're just taking the actual notes that are present and not inserting any passing tones or anything else, but distributing in such a way that it gives a different feeling than just moving straight down parallel. And so that's the first technique that he uses, is the Faubardon technique. The second thing that he likes to use is something that was popular in the Baroque era, and it's sometimes called Neuma or sospira, meaning the breath, the breathing motive, or sighing motive. And this is something we hear in so many works from Bach, Pergolesi, Telemann. The Baroque composers were very fond of this kind of movement where we go. That kind of sighing, that kind of movement down and up, which is and if you can hear that in the vocal works. For instance, this is one by Pergolesi where you can hear that. So here you're going to hear it in an instrumental form in the opera with Cohn, and it goes by very quickly in this case. This is right after the child has died. You'll hear this, his reference to this lament, sighing motive, but it's happening in the orchestra and not in the voice yet. So, and it goes by very fast, but you'll hear it, and I orchestrated it so that it passes between the different instruments. Not a great recording quality, but you can kind of hear this. Okay, I know it goes by fast, but it's the same idea. Dia, 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 kind of sequence down. So he's clearly aware of the tradition of laments in the work, and he's doing his own take on it, although the harmonic language is not really very much different than what you would find in the classical and romantic periods. He's not putting any extraneous dissonances in there as you might find in Stravinsky or Bartok or somebody else doing a similar kind of a gesture. And so sometimes I had the problem that Cohn would end a scene where he would just have a tremolo happening like this. And there were several of those, and I assumed that they were intended for scene changes in a kind of low budget production. Now, the original production that he did was in the Kaminsky Theater in Warsaw, not the main theater, unfortunately. So this is a smaller theater. It's a pared down production. He's playing the piano and actually singing the bass voice part of it. There are no instruments there. There is a choir, the Schnur choir, but it's just piano, his voice, and the choir. So they really did a pared down production of this thing. And I don't know why those tremolos were there in the end. I assumed that they were there for a later production where scene changes were intended, but those never happened in the production. So when I was encountering those, a couple of them I took out, and some of them I just extended with a period where I would just put a little bit more activity in there, such as this kind of. So that all that was happening was before that. So I have this kind of cascading thing just to bridge that over, out of respect to keeping some of that intact, but not always, when I felt like the drama would suffer by having that happen. It's clear that nothing is happening at that point in the orchestra and something needs to be done. So, well, the work wouldn't be complete without the use of the harp, which, as I said, we didn't have in the original performance. And so when the typical characteristics that we know of for the harp are the strumming effect that it does and the glissandi that they can do. So when we hear a work that's happening 6 years before Cohn, for instance, Bluebeard's Castle from Bartok, you can hear the typical use of the harp strumming. This is Bartok's Bluebeard's Castle, which uses a harp. So that's just to give you the feeling of a real harp. Since I didn't have a harp, the way I solved that problem was to have the violins, the string section, strumming quadruple stops, all 4 strings. So I had to voice the chords, not in the way exactly that Cohn has arranged them, but in a way that works for the strings so that they can just strum, put their fingers on the fingerboard and strum the correct chords. And just to add to that, I have a violin that's playing harmonics, a very high, glassy sound, just to give it a top edge to be sure that not only the bottom is there, but there's a little bit of crystalline top that's going above the voice. And so this is the imitation. I also use the piano, by the way, with very soft chords. So it's really the piano playing a kind of a harp-like section, and then the strings doing the same to get this feeling of a harp, but not strictly because of the harmonics, staying with that. So it sounds like harp and a high glassy sound with against the voice, and this is what this sounds like. So the problem in an orchestra when you have the piano is that the acoustics of every hall is going to be different. So adjusting the piano for the particular hall so that it doesn't sound exactly like a piano, but is rather the backing of the orchestra, is something that we'll have to contend with in the performance in Toronto. I don't know the acoustics of the Glen Gould Theatre, but that's something that a conductor would be in the rehearsal would be saying, okay, we need the harp here. It's clear that this is what the orchestrator wants. I'll be there for the very last rehearsal, so I'm sure I could tell them, but it's clear, and I think we've already spoken about this, but to make it so that the piano is not too loud and recognizable as a piano. And that's really dependent on the acoustics and how loud the pianist is playing. And those are the kind of things that you need to adjust in a performance in the on site in the hall itself. So another thing that I noticed about Cohn's writing, and this is a criticism, I had to be very critical of dealing with this work because there are problems that need to be solved. And you can't solve a problem unless you know what the problem is. And so you need to analyze the work to be able to find out what is his intention and how is he realizing it, and is he realizing it correctly. One of the problems that we have is that when he writes contrapuntally, that means where, like in a canon, where one voice begins and another one begins, Cohn is, how can I say it? He wasn't a master of counterpoint based on what I was able to observe in his works. Neither was Schubert, for that matter, who lamented about this fact his whole life. The strict science and art of counterpoint requires a lot of study and a lot of practice. And you can see this in the works of Beethoven. And Schubert, at the very end of his life, was taking lessons from a Jewish guy to improve his counterpoint right before he died. And even Berio, when he's orchestrating restoring the unfinished symphony, is actually using some of Schubert's counterpoint exercises, which are replete with mistakes, by the way. So Cohn, for instance, in this particular part of the opera, he has a little bit of a canon that's happening where one voice begins and another one enters and then the third one. So it's a three-part canon at unevenly spaced intervals. And the problem here is that, first of all, it's very wide. It covers a large range. And so it's very hard to get one instrument to answer another instrument when the range is so big for each one of them. And this is I would say a flaw, but something that I didn't exactly solve. I didn't try to solve this particular one. What happens is the clarinet begins, and this is something that I respected Cohn's wishes to have the clarinet begin and the flute come and then the bassoon. But the problem is that when the flute comes in, it comes in on the same note of the clarinet at that point. And so you don't hear its entrance. The flute is a much lighter instrument than a clarinet, especially when the clarinet gets up in the higher register. So when the flute in its mid register is playing the same note as a clarinet in its higher register, you don't hear the entrance of the flute. And so I just kept it the way that Cohn had it, but you can hear that little flaw. It's very, when the flute enters with the same theme, you can't quite hear it. So that da 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 dee da da, when the flute da 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 da, you don't hear it very very easily. And so that's a flaw, one of the few flaws that I didn't correct, like I said. So you can hear it's kind of Baroque-like, and you do hear the entrance of the bassoon. So that's just a little aside as to the difficulties that we have when orchestrating something and trying to respect the wishes of the composer. I suppose I could have gone more into correcting that, but chose not to. So when I'm working with the parts that we constructed ourselves, I went back to some of the other songs that Cohn has written, and one of them is Yosselbeer, a well-known song. Even Daniel Kahn does a great version of this in his Painted Bird ensemble. But here's Sidor Belarski singing one of Henrik Cohn's songs. And the reason why I chose this was because it deals with a soldier. My name is Yosselbeer, and I serve in the army. I wear boots and a uniform, just like, pardon the comparison, an officer. And this is what this song sounds like.
Heiss ich Josselbeer, und ich dien in Militär, Stiefel trug ich am Mundier, leavdel wie ein Offizier. Josselbeer, gedient in Militär, Josselbeer, dient in Militär.
Okay, and that's a well-known song. And like I said, I chose it because Yosselbeer is a soldier, and so is Uriah. And so I decided to kind of connect myself to other works of Cohn. It's possible that Cohn himself might have used this theme. He does write it later in life, but composers often recycle their own works in different ways. I even do it in this particular version of a lullaby that I wrote for another work. But in this case, what I did with this was to take that song and use it in the winds and in the strings as a background to the spoken voice of Nathan, the prophet, when he's admonishing David for his sins. So this is the first point in the opera where it's my work and not Cohn's. And I made that clear because it's also the first time and the only time that we're using spoken word against the music, just like in Honegger's Le Roi David. But like I said, this one, there's a musical backing behind this. But I wanted the spoken word to kind of stand out as a marker for now we're in new aesthetic territory outside of Cohn. This is the new part that's not Cohn. But like so we're dealing with Cohn's own work as that background. And so what you're hearing here is that Yosselbeer song, but it's set very differently with very different harmonies. But you're also hearing a hint of the baby crying in the background. And those are taken over by the woodwinds, that you'll hear the woodwinds crying a little bit, little specks of baby cries. Just as because I envisioned this as having a visual element, which is sorely lacking in the Cohn score. It's really an oratorio. And so we'll see how this happens in the Toronto production, if there will be visuals for this. I myself don't even know what they'll be. But I envisioned it as having a background of a baby crying while perhaps Nussin is admonishing David in another room altogether. So here you're going to hear the combination of Yosselbeer, the song in the background, the spoken voice of Nussin, and the crying of the baby, all three at the same time.
Und sagt der Gott Jehova, der Gott vom Volk Israel, ich stelle euch an dir ein Unglied, an dir und auf dein Holz. Die verborgenen Meister deine, mit Blumen alt an euch. Du hast probierst du eingenommen, gelost im Halben. Seit die Zeit im Himmel, kommen mit Opfer mit dir weg. Meine Feinde geben als Rettung in die Hände. Denn liegen mit sein Konzile, sein Schelpen werden gestellt. Das Bild, was erst geworden ist hier, am Frieden im Land. Es tut mir Leben euch sein Schirm. Sein Schirm ist wie Ammon.
So that's with the point where he says, Sein Shir is wie Ammon, his lifespan is going to be that of a poppy seed, talking about the baby that's going to be killed, that's going to die now as a result of his actions. So he's just been admonished. And at this point, then, I'm going to use another piece of music that Cohn himself wrote, and that's the Dybbuk niggin, the niggin that you'll find that's sung by the Hasidic people in his later score, the Dybbuk from 1938 or 37. And let me just adjust this a little bit here. So this is the niggin as it appears in that film. It's a little bit faint, but you'll hear it as it gets a little bit louder. Okay, we're going to go about 15 more minutes, just so if you hold on. So taking that particular theme, what I did with it was to, there's a war scene that happens after this in David's head. He's replaying almost the scene of the war where Uriah gets killed. And as you read the commentaries, the Talmudic commentaries about whether David was guilty or not, one of the arguments for him not committing adultery was the fact that Uriah was not Jewish. And so this foreignness is something that's used as a justification that under Jewish law, Bathsheba was never really married because her husband wasn't Jewish. And so some of the rabbis in the commentaries absolve David of his sin of adultery by saying that Bathsheba wasn't married in the first place. And this idea of otherness was something that I wanted to at least bring into this part of the opera. And I leaned on a very random decision to use candomblé rhythms. This is a Brazilian form religion, and it has very specific drumming patterns. And so what I did was to notate those drumming patterns. And here they are. You can hear them if you can locate the four different parts of these rhythms. This is what it sounds like in the aggregate. So it's hard to differentiate between those instruments, but one of them is going dum dum da 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 dum dum da 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 da. Another one's going da 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 da. Another was da 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 da. Putting these all together into an orchestration, it was just, I used it as a template, and I set that for the strings in the lower part and the winds, taking those different parts and also taking the piano, putting the piano in there to get a little bit more brightness. And this is what that kind of war scene in David's head then sounds like, using candomblé representing the foreigner. Sounds like. Oh, and I forgot to say that the melodic material is the Hasidic niggin, but you can't really hear it. It's not. You can kind of hear it because it's spread out through the orchestra, but that's the basis of it, but it's rhythmicized in this candomblé sequence. Okay, so I'll stop it there. That clicking sound, all that you're hearing is I think sometimes the violinists playing Colenio with their woods playing on the sticks, but also the choir members have rocks in their hands to give kind of the feeling of an actual war, the sounds of war, but also making a reference to the Jewish graveyard where you put stones on the gravestones by Jewish tradition. So I have the choir. I was conflicted about whether to do that or not. It's not easy to have a score in your hand as a choir member, and then to pick up a stone and have to whack it. And the stones are messy. They kind of split and get all. But I kept it anyway. I was waffling between it being a hokey thing to do and something just sonically that I wanted, just a sound that I liked. When you have 20 people banging stones together in different rhythms, it sounds kind of cool. So there's just that wanting to get that sound. So at the very beginning of the opera, in the overture, we do have, or first movement of it, we get a sound, a series of chords that Cohn uses that he never picks up again. And they're called augmented chords. It's this chord right here. You get it, very creepy sound. You get it in horror films and, slash films all over the place. But he uses it in the very beginning, and then he leaves it, and it never appears again in the opera. And I was confused when I saw that. I said, did he make a mistake? No, it seems intentional. Do I use that or not? And I thought, yeah, I mean, this is like, a thread that's there that never weaves into anything into the opera. So why not pick it up and use it? It's like, I thought maybe he did use it in the parts that were missing. Anyway, that sound in the orchestra sounds like this. Just that much. Now, it goes into more traditional harmony right after that. So here's... It goes totally normal after that. So I thought, okay, I'm going to pick that one up, and I'm going to use it. I call it, it's like the loose end augmented chord motive. That type of chord is called an augmented chord. And so what I did was I rotated it in the orchestra round and round and round. It just keeps going and going and going, while David is almost going crazy with guilt. Going after Uriah, saying, please, please forgive me. Why are you turning your back on me? And he sees the ghost of Uriah receding in the future, eventually disappears. And the choir at this point is also singing that niggin again, that same. But it's starts to dissipate as the work goes on, so that you don't hear all the passing tones. You just hear kind of. That kind of lose its connective tissue after a while. And so I added those together as the background for David, who appears to be, he's using davening prayer motives in his singing, and it should be done very quickly and almost like, just very quickly, but it's actually notated in tones, and this is what it sounds like. And it goes on and on. Okay, so as you can see, this is the actual text that he's singing in that kind of davening way, in that prayer way. And there's a lot of text that Michael Wex wrote. And so while setting that, I realized this might be very difficult to do. There's a lot of words, and there's not a lot of rhyme that happened. So, and I was happy to take that on. It was quite a challenge. And so I made the decision to have it be like davening rather than having it be lyrically sung in any way. And so, the task was to fit a lot of words into, a movement and have it be singable. So after that happens, I used where Bathsheba is actually cradling the child. And this is the part that I really enjoy doing, because this is where I'm envisioning a kind of a multi-planed sequence on the stage, where David is on one side of the stage and Bathsheba is in another room with her child who's still alive. And there's an old lullaby that's sung in Yiddish, and I only have a modern version of this, but I'll play the melody for you and how I said it. So I originally had set this when we did my own opera called Lilith the Night Demon back in 2014 with the San Francisco choral artists, and set it for choir. And this is what it sounds like. And I kind of reused that in the where Basheva is rocking her crying child, not yet dead. And this is what it sounds like now. Rather than having the choir sing it, I have the movement done by the woodwinds, which have a little bit of a harsher sound than if I had set it for strings. Setting it for strings would have been very soft, like the choir sound that you just heard. But I wanted this to be a little bit more foreboding of the death that's going to come, the tragedy that's going to come. So in this, you can hear the two piccolos a half step apart. That's the crying child. Very done, not realistically, but almost, as a, stylistically. Just you can hear the child crying every once in a while with those two piccolos on top. That's it. So. Okay, I only plan to go to 15 minutes, but I'm going to go a little bit over. We're almost done. I hope you can have stuck with me this long. I can't see any of you. So after that, what happens is she sings the song that I just played for you with the choir, and at the same time, David is begging God not to kill the child. So she's still singing this this lullaby, but a different part of it. And this is what that sounds like. So you can hear David's voice underneath pleading with God not to take the child. And at that point, what happens is that text leaves off where he says, "Please strike me and torment me, blind me." This is what Wex wrote, but spare Basheva's child. And right at that point, the choir comes in, and I'll play you what I based that on. There's a Moroccan Yedid Nefesh, a piyut, a religious poem that's very old, this melody, and I used the melody itself, but said it in a very different way. So here's the original melody. So interesting about this text is that it is at the part where I cut it off. I didn't set the whole text. It says, "Majestic, beautiful radiance of the universe, my soul pines. It is sick for your love. Please, oh God, heal her now." And so I applied that almost out of context to apply to Basheva, who's about to lose her child. And so the choir comes in, it kind of just descends on the work at this moment where David says, "Please don't kill the child." The celestial choir comes in and they sing this Moroccan Yedid Nefesh in a very impressionistic style, a style that I love. And I said it with kind of the woodwinds are swirling about, but the melody is intact, but it's set in a very lush, impressionistic way. So you hear the kind of the woodwind swirling about, almost as if they're angels swirling about, but they're really angels of death. So. Okay, you get the idea. So it's kind of fooling David or the audience into believing that there's going to be a reprieve, that David is not going to have to suffer, and Bathsheba have to suffer the death of their first newborn. But this is where then it flips back to the moment where we get back to the lullaby, where Bathsheba is soothing the baby, and you can hear the piccolos going at the top, and Nassan actually says to David, God has remitted your sin. He's accepted your repentance. And David says, you mean he's forgiven me? And Nassan says, yes, just now, this very minute. And at this moment, the messenger is coming in to say, wait, my lord, my king. And David says, yes, tell me something happy. And the messenger says, your child is dead. And at that point, you can hear the piccolos flatlining, just like you would on an EKG machine in the hospital. Not a joke, but I just used it in that way. So you can hear the lullaby happening and these different planes of things happening. Bathsheba soothing the baby, Nassan absolving David, the messenger telling him that his child has died, and the flatline. And that's the end of my portion of the reconstruction. And this is the point then where we get David's response, where he says, the messenger says, oh, die, the child has died. The mother cradled it until it was dead. And David says, God did not listen to my prayer. Your will is just this way, my God, my God. And it continues on in Cohn's style, which I'll just play here, and then we'll end this lecture with this. Okay, and I'll stop it there. So I went 5 minutes over planned. I don't know. So thank you very much for those of you who've stuck this out. And thank you so much, Eric, for giving me the opportunity to present all this. I don't know how this works with question and answer, if that's even possible in this forum. But so I'll just stop the share right now and thank all of you. Thank you. Okay. I guess we're still live.
Hello.
Okay, I can hear you. Everybody else is muted right now.
Can you hear me, Josh?
I can hear you. Yes, I can.
Okay, great. I'm back. Are you? Have you completed your your presentation?
Yeah. Oh, so you weren't there?
No, I was.
Yes.
No. I'm right here, but I had an audio lag as I was muting my live feed on Facebook and getting back over here. So I'm going to come back on video and join you.
I see you. Yes.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating as always, and really kind of certainly whets my appetite for the performances here next week. And I hope that everybody viewing will be joining us at the Glen Gould Studio next week for the festival for these performances. And I'm not sure there's much more to say. Thank you so much for making the time to give this presentation, Josh, and for your incredible work. You're like a musical archaeologist, rescuing these lost treasures and turning them into things that we can experience today. So it's really fantastic.
It's a job, but thank you. Thanks for that. Thanks for the kind words. Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, so do we just go then?
I think we're just going to go. I think we're going to say thanks to everybody for tuning in, and hopefully we'll all see you at Glen Gould Studio next week and at the Ashkenaz Festival all of next week.
Yes.
And of course, you can get all the information on the festival and the tickets from our website, ashkenaz.ca. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Where we'll also have Q&As, by the way, I think after the performances, right?
Yes, actually, that's a good thing to note is that the performances will be structured with the full opera will be performed, the one-act opera in the first half of the show. Then there'll be a break. And then there will be a talk back and discussion between Josh and the other principals involved in the show and questions from the audience. So it should be an interesting experience.
Great.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.